Namaste everyone, and welcome to our antenatal class with Sister Ingrid Groenewald. Today she'll be speaking to us about how to try to have a good birth. So welcome, Ingrid.
Thank you very much for having me. And today we're going to talk about how to try for a really good birth. And there are some things that we can try to, that you can try to have to, that's going to help with a really good experience for your birth. The first one is to choose your birth team correctly, and by doing your research with that. If we think about birth, and if you think that when you find out you're pregnant, you're starting to think about the birth itself, it's quite important to think where you're going to go, what you want, and by doing the research to see, is it a possibility to actually have that where either the hospital or the care provider that you want to go to. Do the research as to, for example, with a natural birth, how possible is it to have a natural birth with that specific hospital or that specific care provider? And also by thinking with your birth team, who else is on the birth team? If you have your husband, your partner, your sister, a really good friend, or whoever else that you're going to feel really good and supported with. That is the very crucial point to think about to have a really good experience with a birth. The next point is to let labor start on its own. And this is also quite important. One often hears that people were told that you have to have your baby at a certain date, or not after a certain date, or perhaps you're going to go on holiday, or you want your specific date, the birth date of the baby, that it's quite an important date for you. But let me tell you, it's much better if your baby initiates labor, that labor actually starts when it's ready to go, when your body's ready to go into labor. This is quite an important thing to really understand, that often if you try to go into labor, if one tries to put you into labor, and this is where inductions come in, if you have an induction and your body is not ready to have the baby, or to actually that you are going to go into labor and have really good strong contractions, is that sometimes the baby might go into fetal distress, or the one thing leads to the next, and before you know it, you're off for an emergency cesarean. So this is really an important topic, or an important point to really understand. So to really try for a good birth, it would be to try to avoid any interventions like the induction, to that it can actually, that your body can go into labor on its own. So that is the second point. Then the third one is that once you go into labor, is that you have to move around. Gone are the days to lie in bed. And unfortunately, one often sees that when you go to the hospital, you often see women lying in bed when they are in labor. And that is actually not the best to do, because when you are lying down, you're working against gravity, and you're actually closing the pelvis. So because when you're lying, it's actually closing in on itself. By being upright and by moving around, you're opening the pelvis, and this is what we want. It makes for an easier way for the baby to move down into the pelvis and to really work with gravity, with the weight of baby. So the possibility to have a good birth, and a quicker birth, that is by really doing the movement, by doing things, by walking around, using the birth ball, different positions, and just using gravity to your advantage. So that will also help to have a quicker birth, because we all don't want to be in labor for forever. You want to have a quicker kind of birth, and that will help with that as well. The extra support is also crucial here, and this is where I touched on it with the first point to say choose your birth team correctly. But the extra support here would also be by considering having a doula. And you might have heard of a doula before. If not, I can just briefly explain to you. A doula is a lay person who it's usually a lay person, but it can also be a medical person or a person with a medical background, who is there purely for physical and emotional support. So that person is there to be supporting both of you, so the mom and the dad in labor. And that is really a good thing, especially in an environment where you perhaps don't feel quite comfortable. if you're in a hospital, you don't know the people, you don't know exactly the protocol, what is going on. It's a clinical environment. And by having a doula, for example, it's the person, the between yourselves and the hospital. And you would know that person beforehand so that you can really then help to get the wishes that you want. For example, if you don't want your baby to be taken away, that then will be a good person to really try to enforce that and to have that your baby will stay with you at all times. So the doula is an important support person that can be with you. And this is also sometimes a sister or somebody else, but it is to support both the couple, the mother and the father, or the expectant mother and father with a doula. So that is something that one can definitely consider. The next thing to avoid is any kind of interventions that can actually happen sometimes in hospitals. The first one is often drips or IV fluids. So if we think about any kind of hospital experience, and even if you've been in hospital before, you might remember that sometimes there are drips that are placed in. That's IV fluids that will be, that's connected onto your arm. And even immediately, if we think about if you've got IV fluids that are connected to you, you are suddenly a little bit hindered with movement because you can't just get out of bed and walk around because you have this thing suddenly that is attached to you. And by trying to think, okay, now how can you best to try to avoid that is to really drink your liquids, drink water, drink your Powerade, any kind of juices that give you energy. I would definitely just stay away from any caffeine drinks, so not the Red Bulls and the Monsters and so on, but any kind of other juice or water would be a good idea to drink. And then you're hydrating yourself and you're getting the fluids in, so there's no need to think that you actually have to add fluids from an external source. If you have a drip, then you have a drip stand often, and when you're walking, you're pushing this thing along. So you can understand that sometimes it becomes quite a difficult thing to do, so then people just stay in bed. And this is the one thing that we want to avoid with you currently, to say, try to not be in bed, try to move around often, try to be upright, and then obviously by trying to not have an IV fluid attached to you. The next thing also here would be continuous fetal monitoring. And that is if you had a baby before, or if you've been to the hospital before, you might remember and know that they listen to the baby's heartbeat with the fetal monitor. It's a machine that, there are 2 points. The one is placed at the top of the uterus, and that basically picks up the kind of strength of the uterus, the contractions. And then the other one is being placed on the higher end of the back of the baby. And what happens is that it actually records how the baby is coping and how the baby is doing with contractions. So it's actually a really good tool to have, but it's not good to have that continuously, because if you have this on the whole time, again, you can't move around, you can't be doing things which I suggest you do. So that makes it a little bit more tricky. So you would need to have baby checked every now and then, but it's usually just for a few seconds, or if the machine has to be put on, it's usually for a minute or two. It doesn't have to be for 10 or 20 minutes or 30 minutes, because that is definitely for a normal, natural birth and everything is going well. There's no need to think that it has to be on for a very long time. So definitely press that bell to remind someone, that this machine is still on. So that is really important, to try to not have that machine on you the whole time. And the next thing I would say to try to avoid is any artificial rupturing of membranes. And this is the water breaking. And this is where usually somewhere in labor, somebody might decide, okay, now let's get this labor quicker. So we basically break the water for you, and then, your contractions will increase and the baby will be born sooner. And that might be true but also on the other hand, the contractions will be a lot stronger. And if you're doing well, if you feel that you're coping well, the contractions are actually doing well, you're progressing nicely, there's no need to think that you have to have the water broken or the membranes ruptured, because everything is actually going to plan. So it is something that you can discuss perhaps with your doctor or your midwife to see, is it important to do it now or can you wait? It's no need to think that you have to have the membranes ruptured. Okay, so with anything actually in any kind of environment, if it's at home or if it's in the hospital, I think communication is always important, to have an open line with your caregiver that you can actually ask questions, so that if you don't understand something, that they really also explain to you why you actually have to have it done. So to avoid unnecessary interventions, I would say the IV fluids, try to avoid that, continuous fetal monitoring to avoid that, and then also the artificial rupturing of the membranes, also to try to avoid that. Then the next important thing is the birth positions. This is also an important thing to see, well, how can you have a good birth? Because the birth positions has a direct influence on the birth itself. We know that if you're using an upright position and you're more upright, you're using gravity to your advantage, and that makes sense in the sense that it's much easier for the baby to be born. One often finds that if you lie on your back for a very long time and you're pushing at the final stages just before the birth of the baby, and you're pushing and pushing, that it's very difficult. It's almost like this head is going up, you're pushing, and then the contraction stops and the head is moving down again, and you have to push up again and it's moving down again. And that makes it very difficult sometimes for the baby to be born. If you're more in an upright position, and this could be that you might be squatting, you might be standing on your knees, and that can easily be done in a hospital bed, that you're standing on your knees, you turn around and just lean over the top part of the bed, and you're using gravity to your advantage, because when you're pushing, the head is moving down and it stays there when the contraction is finished, so that with the next contraction you can just continue at that point. So that is also a very important perhaps topic to discuss with your caregiver, as to in what position can you actually give birth, because we all know, and the research also suggests, that upright positions are just a lot easier for mothers and also for babies to be born. Then the last thing that I also just want to say here is that to keep your baby with you at all times is also part of having good experience. And the first one would be immediately after birth. Once the baby's born, if the baby is placed on your chest, skin to skin, and the cord is not cut, and this is what we call delayed cord clamping. If you don't clamp the cord straight away, the baby is getting the oxygen just as your baby is getting oxygen right at this point with you being pregnant, that you are breathing and the baby's getting the oxygen through the placenta and the cord. And that does not stop just because the baby's born. So once the baby's born and is basically placed on your chest, your baby is learning to breathe by inhaling, but then also at the same time, the cord is still attached and the baby still gets the oxygen through the cord, and that is a much gentler kind of birth. We know babies do really well with this, if you delay the cord clamping, and anything is better than nothing. If it's 2 minutes that you can gain before clamping, that baby has a head start. So if it's 10 minutes, that would be great. But this is something that I would also say, discuss with your caregiver, as you say, how long can you actually delay the cord before it's being clamped and cut. There are often possibilities where it's often clamped for a long time later, like half an hour, 20 minutes later. But sometimes that's sometimes more tricky in a hospital environment where perhaps your doctor needs to go back to the rooms. So it is important, a topic to possibly also discuss with your doctor. Another reason for delayed cord clamping is that by thinking, if you think the baby at birth only has about 2/3 of its own blood volume in the body, and the rest of it, so 1/3 of it, is actually sitting in the cord and in the placenta. And if you clamp straight away, your baby's missing out on that. So that is another advantage, as to not to clamp too quickly, because then your baby's getting her own blood back. That's her own, her own blood. And babies do really good with that. They pink up so much quicker. And obviously, like I said before, the oxygen and the breathing is a lot easier. Your baby learns to do that much quicker. So that is immediately the delayed cord clamping, and then the skin to skin, like I mentioned before, that is really important. And then delay any kind of weighing and measurements, I would also add in here. So by removing your baby and by just putting your baby on the scale directly after birth interferes a bit with the interaction or with the instinctive behavior that the baby has of sucking, actually just smelling the little hands, and then after a while trying to figure out, hang on, there's something that is smelling very similar, and then eventually knowing, oh, I need to go to the boob and try to latch on. So there's a whole process. And if you interfere at some point, you are interfering a bit that the baby gets or can get a little bit confused. So we want to delay the weighing and the measurements until after the first feed. And really, there's no need to know exactly what the baby weighed straight at birth, or that the baby, how many centimeters tall the baby was. That can wait. That can wait until the baby already had the first feed. And then the last thing here, by keeping baby with you at all times, that we also know is research-based, is by rooming in with your baby, that the baby stays with you at all times, not in a nursery somewhere. If your baby's with you, you know when your baby's awake and waking up and wants a feed, and you can feed your baby. It is shown that if a baby is placed in a nursery somewhere far away from the mother actually rests not as efficient and not as good, because she's constantly listening to any kind of sounds of babies crying. So you often think, is that your baby or not? So we know it's better if baby is with you, that we know you are actually going to rest a lot easier. So those are the bullet points to think of. What can you do to really try for a really good birth? Because you can, and it is a really good thing. This birth only happens once, so plan ahead, have your questions ready for your care, the provider, and do your research as to where you want to go.